June 4, 1942. The dawn over Midway was a wash of ash and steel, light without color. For weeks the two fleets had been moving like great, careful animals toward a place of coral and reef that seemed almost insignificant on a map. What gathered there was not only metal and aviation fuel, not only the wood of flight decks and the leather of flight jackets. It was a contest of assumptions about how modern war should be waged, what a fleet should be able to endure, and which resources truly decided victory. On the Japanese flag bridges, conversation moved between maps and certainty. Admiral Nagumo's staff had rehearsed this campaign down to signaling flags and the timing of strikes. Their doctrine was elegant: smash the enemy's air power, keep sea control, and finish with the guns and torpedoes. To their eyes, the American carriers, islands of timber and canvas floating on a blue that had been Japanese before, were noisy curiosities. Decks cluttered, pilots inexperienced, doctrines crude. Mockery was not malicious so much as tactical smugness. It assumes that the present edge will last. But confidence is brittle in a theater in which information itself can be bent. In a windowless room at Pearl Harbor, Station Hypo had been assembling fragments of Japanese traffic turned to meaning. Joseph Rockefort and the codebreakers did not work with swagger. They worked in patient, cigarette-smudged increments. Traffic patterns, indicator groups, the absence of an expected kana that suggested a trap. When their analysis placed Nagumo's intention at Midway, Admiral Nimitz made a gambler's calculation. He marshaled Enterprise and Hornet and the hastily patched Yorktown, and he set them like a small, dangerous prize on the table. The first phase of the battle is a study in sacrificial geometry. Torpedo squadrons, VT-8, VT-3, VT-6, in obsolete TBD devastators, loaded like slow armored beetles, flew into a curtain of Japanese fighters and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Men who knew their machines' limitations nevertheless dove through flak with an acceptance of likely death that bordered on ritual. Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, VT-8, broke from the prescribed rendezvous and led his squadron in a bold, fatal run. When the survivors counted bodies, they found heroism interlaced with confusion, brave decisions that bought time, and tactical orders that had not foreseen such devotion. The torpedo attacks failed to score torpedoes, but they achieved something the Japanese had not expected. They pinned combat air patrols low and spread them thin. In those moments, minutes of terrible arithmetic, dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown came streaking down out of the sun. Their attacks were surgical. They found carriers with decks stacked by hurried recovery operations. Ordnance lay exposed like kindling. The bombs punched through hangar decks and ruptured fuel lines. Fires fed fires until ships became floating pyres. Akagi and Kaga burned like temples struck by lightning. Sōryū folded into itself. Hiryū, tenacious to the last, launched counterstrokes and struck Yorktown. Yet later that same afternoon fate found Hiryū as well. The spectacle of destruction has technical detail as its anatomy. The SBD Dauntless Dove with a stabilized sight and a determined pilot, the 1,000-pounders that tore into wooden flight decks did not simply sink ships, they detonated cascades of secondary explosions. Men on the catwalks had seconds to understand what hit them. Ordnance that had been stacked for a strike became the detonator of the carrier's fate. The aircraft carrier is, by design, an intensely productive machine. Its mission requires fuel, bombs, ammunition, and a working flight deck. That very productivity becomes vulnerability when surprise meets proximity. Midway's lesson was less about a single tactical triumph than about the way systems intersect. The Japanese had tactical brilliance, excellent strike coordination, capable pilots, and a doctrine honed in earlier years. America brought a different form of competence, the capacity to translate broken intelligence into deployment, a repair and replacement culture that could risk assets because it could replenish them, and an industrial culture that could convert setbacks into sustainment. The brutality of the exchange, dead pilots, burning carriers, cannot obscure that the Japanese loss was a strategic hemorrhage. A carrier is more than metal. It is a repository of veteran pilots, deck crews, and institutional habits that take months and years to rebuild. Those attributes bled away that June day. The human register is where the battle leaves a visible scar. Ensign George H. Gay, Jr., tossed among survivors in an inflatable, watched his comrades die in the water and recorded, later, the sights of smoke and the peculiar choreography of falling aircraft. Sailors on Yorktown labored like a chorus of men who believed their hands could outrun flame. They patched and re-welded and made faith in steel. On the Japanese ships the smell of burning cordite mingled with the scent of defeat. Commanders flung decisions like ropes into a storm. Launch, recover, refuel, each order a small exponent in the calculation of loss. The strategic effect rippled outward. Japan's offensive initiative slowed and the psychological advantage that had buoyed the Empire's commanders diminished. The loss of 4 carriers and, more painfully, the loss of veteran aviators and squadron leaders created a deficit of experience that Japanese training pipelines could not supply at the speed required. Producing an airframe in a factory is one thing. Producing an experienced launch captain or a pilot seasoned by the Pacific's particular, brutal rhythms is another. Midway revealed that production without deep training and reserves of human capital is an incomplete strategy. Yet the battle also remade American practice. The Navy accelerated repair doctrine, learned to accept risk for strategic positioning, and refined carrier-air group coordination. Codes and scouts found new valuation in the calculus of war. Station hypo success produced a doctrine that elevated intelligence into operational currency. The U.S. industrial marvels, the yards and assembly lines, converted into a logistical domino effect. Enemy losses could be absorbed by scale. Veteran attrition could be mediated by an expanding training pipeline. America's wartime ecosystem, naval, industrial, scientific, was slow to begin but relentless once engaged. Beyond tactics and production, Midway seeded a narrative of humility and adaptation. Officers on both sides learned that doctrine must be elastic. Confidence must be married to contingency. Many Japanese commanders would carry with them a private, irreversible lesson. Technological and doctrinal excellence must be matched by sustainable human and industrial depth. For the Americans, Midway proved that courage without cohesion is brittle, but cohesion without audacity is impotent. The right decisions, at the right time, could amplify sacrifice into strategic advantage. The cultural aftermath is as revealing as the operational one. Among Japanese naval circles, quiet conversations rewired assumptions about the nature of sea power. Among American circles, Midway became a touchstone of confidence and a cautionary tale about complacency. The battle altered training syllabi, ship design considerations, and the logic of fleet composition. Carriers were no longer simply projectors of planes. They became central nodes in a larger, information-driven battle system. Repair yards, code rooms, and pilot schools acquired new prestige beside hangars and gun turrets. If history is a ledger of causes and consequences, Midway reads like a line where mockery was debited and humility credited. The Japanese laughter at the sight of American carriers reflected a momentary superiority. The ocean returned its bill with interest. The encounter did not end the Pacific War. It rebalanced it. It made explicit that modern naval war would be decided not solely by the daring of individual squadrons, but by the integration of intelligence, logistics, training, and industry into a coherent engine of persistence. Men who fought that day carried its images till the end of their lives. The smell of burning aviation fuel, the sudden arithmetic of flame, the cold geometry of survivors in rafts. Admirals and petty officers, pilots and deckhands, lived afterward with a knowledge that the sea is indifferent to swagger. Midway stands as an instance where mockery encountered consequence, where doctrine and industry collided, where intelligence and audacity conspired. It is a long narrative about a short day, and the memory of that day reshaped the maps, the strategies, and the language of naval power for decades to come.